Sound on Sound met with famed computer game composer Richard Jacques to talk about the composition, recording and post-process for the new Guardians of the Galaxy game soundtrack.
This is definitely the biggest project I've ever done in terms of scope of amount of music. The minutes of music is something like close to 6 hours. The amount of assets, the amount of cinematic sequences, big orchestra, choir, synths. Yeah, it's an epic soundtrack with epic proportions. It's basically three cues. It's basically the theme. I first got involved with the project back in 2017. I was contacted by Eidos Montreal, who is the developer of the game, and the audio director there, Steve Szukowski, got in touch and said he'd heard some of my music from both Mass Effect and James Bond Bloodstone, and they liked what they heard, and would I be interested in providing some demo material for the game. So I spent a couple of weeks writing some material that I thought would be appropriate for this project, specifically the main theme, which made it into the game without any changes, which is great. And some incidental material, some underscore, a few stings and things like that to sort of show how I thought the soundtrack should be and the sort of vision that I planned. As I recall, I was working completely blind from the beginning of the demo process. I had a couple of paragraphs on a Word document explaining a little bit about the game and a little bit about the sort of music they were after. And then it was all kind of down to my interpretation and my imagination of how I think the music should sound. Basically, when I'm writing a main theme, I will never write it in my studio. I always do it in my head, walking around or in the park or something. I just find it to be easier to not be distracted by technology or a keyboard or a guitar. I find that can send me down a track that I don't particularly want to go. So I'd always start sort of humming it in my head or singing it into my phone or scribbling it usually on the back of a bank statement. And that gets the initial idea down. But each cue I'm writing, I don't have a set way of working, saying I'm going to do the cellos and then I'm going to do the brass and then I'm going to do the melody. Sometimes it might start with a chord progression, it might start with a mood to get the feel right, and sometimes it might start with a melody and sometimes it might start with a rhythm. During the demo process, obviously I was working purely in MIDI, so if you're interested I can play the main theme in MIDI version. So this is my main Logic session for one of the chapters in the game. As you can see, there are lots of folder tracks and many tracks within those folders. For example, first violins looks like that. The reason for that is I like to have all my articulations fully loaded at any one time. So each Logic session is about 2,500 tracks. And the reason this Logic session is so long, this is nearly 1,500 bars long, is because some of the music in the game, there's obviously long sections, but there's a lot of short stings and intros and outros to tracks. And I realized when I started the project that we would end up having at least over 2,000 individual pieces of music. So it wouldn't have been sensible to have that as individual Logic projects and individual Pro Tools sessions, because when we went to the studio, we'll be constantly loading and saving off different projects, which would be a complete waste of time. So as you'll see in the markers, these are all individual pieces of music, and they're all in one chapter. So we have 16 chapters in the game, plus some front end and some credits music and things like that. But basically, this was the only way of dealing with so many pieces of music. So each Logic session is in the region of 1.3, 1.4 gigabytes. And that is just MIDI data. That's not audio, that's just MIDI data. So that's the average file size. So now let's have a look at the main theme in MIDI land. MIDI setup that I use, especially for this project, was quite, it's certainly larger than I've done before. So I'm mainly working in Logic, and my template for this project was about 2,400 tracks of MIDI and VSTs, etc. And then I also work in Pro Tools as well. So I have Logic working alongside Pro Tools, where I do all my routing, my stemming, and Pro Tools is doing most of my audio work, whereas Logic is doing all my sequencing and all my MIDI, and then I use Sibelius as well for prepping the parts for the orchestra and the conductor. Regarding orchestral libraries, I mean, I've been using them for many years, and it sort of changes depending on what kind of score I'm writing. So one library I might favour for more lyrical work and more legato, and one library I might favour for more action scoring. In this particular project and my current template, I'm using probably about 50-60% of Berlin from orchestral tools, and probably about 40% from Spitfire, and then a few other libraries as well for different kind of effects. But it's mainly Spitfire and Berlin that I use at the moment. When I'm actually working in MIDI and I'm composing the score, I always know that it's going to be replaced by live instruments. So I still kind of go into quite a lot of detail when I'm programming, so that we can put it into the game as we're in development. And then when we go to the studio with the orchestra, it just brings it all to life. When I'm scoring an action game, accents are really key in strings and brass, especially, to get those pointed notes that give a lot of syncopation, a lot of rhythmic interest. So I do spend quite a lot of time working with those. Thematic content in the game. Both myself and the audio director, we realised from the beginning of the development we really wanted to use leitmotifs for some of the characters and some of the enemies. So I set about working out how many we would use. You don't want to use too many themes because they don't have room to breathe and to bring them back. So I normally say any more than 4 or 5 themes is probably too much, because then you can develop them. So yeah, we have a main Guardians theme, we call it the hero theme, and we have 2 specific enemy, 2 villains that have their own theme, and we also have a theme for when you're flying through space. So there's a couple of other little bits and bobs which I won't reveal quite yet for any spoilers, but yeah, there's probably 4 or 5 main themes, and we consciously wanted to do that because this kind of narrative-driven game lends itself to that type of scoring.
Got this! Just don't fall and we'll be fine. Don't fall! Whoa! Whoa, 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 whoa! Ah! Everyone okay?
We should have gone to Maku 4. I would be wary, Rodent.
You know what? I survived freaking Half-World. I think I'm scared of some little...
It's not alone! Get ready!
The scores I write, they are very interactive these days, so they react to what the player's doing and how the player's playing through the game. And this project's no different. For example, in some of the combat sequences, you might start a fight with the enemies in the game, and it starts off quite dark and very action, but quite dark, and it sort of makes the player feel that it's quite a hard fight. But as you progress through it, maybe we introduce some of the hero theme, as we call it, and it's slightly more major key based, so you get a sense of you're getting towards the end of the fight sequence and you're actually achieving something. So we're switching up everything from loops to different layers interactively within the game, so that it seamlessly works throughout the progression of the story and throughout the game as the gamer is playing it.
Keep it together, Jacques!
Bad dog! Bad dog!
We've got the numbers!
Not if you count all the teeth we know! Sector has a new predator!
Avoid the mouth, dodge the tail, slice and clear!
Is anything on this planet not trying to kill us?
There are various interactive scoring techniques that we use in games. And in this particular game, there's a lot of dialogue that has branches. So you can have a conversation and you might have 2 options or 3 options or 4 options. And of course, those 4 options then each have 2 or 3 or 4 options and then another set. So the way I scored those in this particular project was I drew a huge amount of flowcharts I sellotaped about 10 A4 pages together on my dining table so that I could start at the beginning and work out all the branches and where the convergence point comes towards the end of a scene. And then every branch that the player may or may not choose is scored completely originally, so that the tone is correct for whatever the dialogue is, whatever the mood is of a particular scene. So yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into the choices that the player can make and the music that accompanies those choices. It's not just a question of just having a 8-bar loop in it, or certainly I didn't want to do that. So you could have a 30-second conversation between the characters and there may be 20 pieces of music that make up that one segment. When working on a branching system in a game, the composer always has to work very closely with the developers. In this situation, I was working with the audio director and the narrative department and actually reading reams and reams of scripts that have points in saying sequence A goes to sequence D, sequence B goes to sequence E, etc., etc. And that's how I was able to work out the flow of a particular conversation. So yes, tight working relationship and collaborative working relationship between the composer and the audio director is absolutely key. And also other members of the team, some of the sound designers, so that we know what the sound design approach is going to be for a certain level or a certain cinematic, and the narrative department as well, and the combat department and the cinematic department. There's a lot of people that the composer is in touch with, but primarily point of contact is the audio director. From the beginning of the project, I knew that it was largely going to be an orchestral score, but not exclusively. When I started learning about some of the characters, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to utilise choir and choral effects, not just sung choir, but we've got some, as we call it, demonic whispering in a few sections of the game, which is for a specific character. So choir and vocal effects was something I wanted to utilise, but also with synthetic elements, not just synths, but also electronic percussion as well. I often use it when I'm scoring an action game, especially. So I would have some software synths, but I would also utilise hardware synths as well, especially for pads and some very low synth pads. The Jupiter 8 was used on a lot of that, and the Memory Moog, and some of the Junos. They're just really handy. They sit very well in the mix when you've got live instruments as well, whereas some of the VSTs can have a sound of their own that's not particularly wanted when you're trying to blend everything together. So I use a combination of plugins and hardware synths, and they're usually there to, their function is either backing up things in the orchestra. So for example, if I've got a very deep cello and basses that are live, and then there's a piece in the cinematic that I want to emphasise, I'll bring in another very low pad, and I will always use an analog hardware synth for that, because it just gives so much extra depth, I find. I would sort of use the orchestra first. I would usually write with the orchestra first, and then I might add bits of electronic percussion or some synths, only if it's warranted. It's not a synth-heavy score, but I would say 10% of the overall sound is synths and electronic percussion. The preparation for the live recordings actually started probably as far back as 2019, specifically for booking studio time for a project of this nature. We had something like 11 days at Abbey Road, which is very hard to get in one block. So I booked that over a year in advance. Also, I gave the musicians a lot of notice that this would be happening, so that they will make sure they were free. But of course, when the pandemic hit, everything changed, and the studios were closed and the musicians couldn't work, and I was stuck in my spare bedroom with a couple of old Macs and some small speakers trying to write. So things, the goalposts were constantly shifted for all of us during COVID. And I think we managed to rebook the recording session for 2 months after we were originally going to do it, which was quite difficult. Again, finding another 11-day block at Abbey Road and all the musicians free. Luckily, the musicians sadly weren't working a lot, so they were very hungry for the session recording time. And at this time, there wasn't much live performance happening, so there was no tours, there was no real concerts, West End shows, those kind of things. So the musicians generally were free, but still getting studio time was very difficult. So we started planning the recording sessions probably late 2019, and then actually all the Sibelius work and preparing the music and the scores started in earnest in about February of this year, 2021. And then this is part 3. Oh, yeah. So that'd be from here.
From here?
10-9-0. We did most of the recordings at Abbey Road Studios, especially the brass and the choir. The strings we did in various locations due to social distancing, and some of them were already recording in lockdown when they could record. There were some remote players working in their own studios. It's not like a bedroom situation. They have professional studios within their house with treated rooms and good microphones. But we had to start that process early because there was so much to record. So some of the strings started recording back in March when we didn't start at Abbey Road until June. And we were still in lockdown in March. So I had to look at who was available, who had their own studios and their own equipment. And I had to audition some people that, although they were amazing players, they didn't quite have the right mic set up, or you could hear traffic noise, or they didn't have a treated room. So there were lots of recordings happening around the country, and even the guitar was done in Austin, Texas. And, you know, the Ethnic Wind was done in Switzerland. There was lots of things happening that all had to sort of come together at the right time so that we were ready to mix. So it was part of the whole pandemic situation that led us to do it this way. And I knew that with the strings, we would need to glue everything together, both in terms of editing and to create the sound, so that you've basically got a 50-piece string section done with about half of that number of players due to social distancing. But I'm delighted with the results, and I knew that when my engineer, Jake Jackson, was coming to mix, he would be able to work his magic, which he did, and it sounds like it's recorded in just one room at one time, but for COVID reasons, we had to do it in slightly unorthodox ways. But it's always about the end result, and we were lucky that the A list of the players were free because there were no concerts happening. So we had, a lot of leaders from major UK orchestras.
Video game world, there's so much going on at any moment, and obviously the video games themselves are so complex that the amount of music required seems vast. It seems so much bigger than a regular movie, and you cover just the gamut of emotions, and I love it. And you can, even though we don't get to see the screen and what's going on when we record, what the intentions are. If it's an exciting moment or a more pensive moment or the great theme moment. What they've put down on the paper and what they've imagined and what they've composed is fantastic, so that the emotions are there. But then we have to deliver that as well. We have to put it through the instruments and bring it to life. And it's exhausting. It's you're feeling it. And it's every take is the take. You can't relax. So, take 17 or something has to be as on the ball and brilliant, as exciting as take 1.
When I'm scoring an action game, a lot of the music is very challenging just by the nature of what it is. So in terms of strings, there's a lot of very, very fast notes, a lot of jumping around, a lot of arpeggios, a lot of ostinatos, staccatos, etc. So you have to really plan the recording sessions so that people have time to rest. People's arms aren't going to drop off. The same with the brass. I mean, I write quite challenging parts for the brass, as they will concur. So I need to make sure that they've got enough time between takes to get the blood back in their lips, to make sure their embouchure's not being tested too much, because otherwise it's a false economy. You can actually end up, exhausting the musicians that they can't physically play the high notes anymore. That's very rare. I mean, London is pretty much one of the only places you can deliver this kind of material, but you have to factor in that they're playing their hearts out and they are such incredible musicians. I always say, let me know when you need a break, let me know how the lips are, and because I was a trombone player, I understand that completely, so I can kind of preempt that. And also string players are always advising me, we can do this, or we might need to do that, or we'll record this in chunks, or we'll have a break here. So it's a question of just working with them, making sure the musicians are happy, making sure we're not working them too hard, but at the same time keeping on schedule and on budget as well.
I think there's about 5.5 hours of music in the video game, so it's an absolutely mammoth project. And a lot of it is very high action, exciting stuff, which is great for us brass players because we get to play on lots of the big action cues, which are exciting. Richard's writing for brass is just fantastic. Richard's a trombone player, or I'm not sure, it's probably a while since he's played the trombone. But he writes so well for brass, and all of the big themes are written so well for the instruments. And it's very, very exciting stuff. So yeah, when it comes out in the game, it's going to be absolutely epic.
With regard to the musician I work with, sometimes I use an orchestral contractor, and I did on this project, and I'm a trombone player originally, so I know all of the brass players that were my contemporaries and played in orchestras and big bands with, so I know the players personally, and I will often, especially with the brass, I'll often say exactly who I want on whichever section and whichever desk. Strings and wind, I let the contractor arrange that because that's not my area of expertise. But yeah, on a project like this, you definitely need an orchestral contractor who they do an amazing job of making sure all the legal side is covered, all the financial side is covered, and you don't have to worry because it's always a very pressure-intensive situation for the composer because you have to deliver this and you have to make sure it's done on time and on budget. So yes, I will use an orchestral contractor for that. The mixing part of the project is equally as epic. When I spoke to Jacques probably 12 months ago and I told him roughly how we were going to do it, and he said, well, how long is it? And I said, well, it's over 5 hours. And that's basically a whole month and then some mixing. He said it was the longest mix he's ever done. So we were having to do probably in the region of 10, 15 minutes mixes a day for 27 days or something. We were mixing throughout the whole of August. There was quite a tight turnaround before finishing recording Abbey Road. I think we finished recording on the 29th or 30th of July, and the 1st of August we started mixing. So we mixed here in my studio, we mixed in 7.1 surround. So all the music is in 7.1, and we also used stems. We also used 7.1 stems, multiple stems as well. So brass 7.1, choir 7.1, etc., etc. And yes, a lot of channels. We were running the sort of largest configuration of Pro Tools that we could get. So we got 192 I/O, 3 HDX cards, the latest version of the software. And the latest version of software came out only a couple of weeks before we started mixing, and it was a godsend having the hybrid engine. We found it to be very, very good, and having a lot of the 7.1 reverbs sounded great. So yeah, definitely an epic mix project as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Pro Tools session. This is the final mix of the main theme. For this project, we did mix entirely in the box for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's all in 7.1, and there are not that many hardware units that we can utilise for that kind of surround technology. Also, recallability factor. There's so many cues in this game. I think the amount of files I delivered was over 2,000. So any small edits or any small fades or any loops that I had to tweak or check or author new ones, I needed to just be able to load it up even after we'd finished mixing, and just do whatever the game team needed. So it was imperative that it was a completely recallable mix. So we decided to do it straight in the box. So we were using a lot of UAD plugins, which have such a fantastic sound, especially a lot of the EQs and compressors and things like that. For the surround plugins, we were using some of the Liquid Sonics, reverbs especially. Cinematic Rooms is great, Symphony 3D, a few other bits and bobs. Some of the new gen plugins were really useful for surrounds and monitoring. Yeah, those were the main tools we were using, plus a few other slightly more obscure plugins, but those are the plugins we relied on. In terms of technology, this project has made me realise that I really rely heavily on the Dante system. So in my studio, I run a lot of the Focusrite RedNet products, which I've been using for a few years, but during this project, I've actually put a lot more of that kit in here. And the reason for that is you're dealing with so many channels and so many streams of music that I'm actually running 128 streams from Logic straight into Pro Tools, and they have another 64 streams coming in from my hardware synths and outboard gear. And I don't think there's a system better than that I could have utilised for this project, because everything's saved in an XML file. I can reroute anything at the touch of a button and completely recallable. Everything's stemmed out already. All my templates are set up with all the stems in. It's been a fantastic innovation. I suppose in the last 10 or 15 years for me, it's been the most exciting and the most game-changing products and network for the way I work. So that's been absolute godsend. I think a lot of people don't realise quite how much work there is, how long it takes. An average day for me is sort of 7 a.m. till midnight, often 7 days a week. This project I did 9 months with 4 days off, which was pretty challenging, both physically and mentally and creatively. But you get used to knowing how productive you are, and if something's not happening, you move on to something else. So it is any big score is a lot of work, and I think for a composer working in this kind of industry, and also in film as well, it applies to film as well, be prepared for some seriously long hours, be prepared to say goodbye to your social life. It's part of the job, to be frank. It is part of the job, and things change and schedules move and cinematics get recut, and you have to be on the ball, and you have to deliver. It's as simple as that. So, but at the end of the day, it's definitely the most rewarding experience I've had on this project, and it's only a few years of my life, so I would definitely do it all over again.
That's all for now. If you like what you saw, please be sure to like and share it, and subscribe and click the bell icon so you know when we upload new content to our YouTube. Also find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Thanks for watching.